Hey, Sasha D. Julian here, professional climber and Protect Our Winters Alliance member. And we are here to talk about money because money talks and it's affecting our climate crisis. Our climate is warming and it's putting our $887 billion outdoor economy in peril. We need a hard stop on the financing of fossil fuel projects. For an industry that depends on access to fresh air, clean water, consistent snowpacks, and open forests, the fossil fuel industry is plain bad for business. Join Protect Our Winters and our partners, and let's learn how we can put our money where our interests are. See you at the crag.
Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Ben Gubitz. I am the Campaigns and Advocacy Director at Protect Our Winters, welcoming you all to Moving Mountains with Money, Climate Finance 101, a really important conversation around the role that finance has in driving climate change. We're so excited to have all of you on here with us today. There was about over 200 CEOs, CFOs, and people from finance teams from companies all across the country that are joining us here right now. And I really appreciate everyone taking the time to have this important and critical discussion with us. A couple housekeeping things before we get started with the presentation. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a chat feature and a poll feature. We'll be throwing out some poll questions throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions, feel free to plug them right into the chat feature. And so this presentation was designed and coordinated by Protect Our Winters in partnership with Conservation Alliance, 1% for the Planet, Bank of the West, Green Alpha Advisors, Amalgamated, and Atmos. And we're just thrilled to have everybody here. And I'm going to go ahead and throw up just a sample poll question so everybody has an idea of how the polls work. And I'm going to go ahead and share that now. So feel free to, hold on a second. I'm going to have our technical director, Maddie, work on that one while folks are joining. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Executive Director of Protect Our Winters, Mario Molina, to join the stage here and start the presentation. So Mario, welcome, and welcome to all.
Hi, Ben. Thank you so very much. I hope everybody can hear me. Are we live, Maddie? Awesome. So thanks so very much for making time for yet another webinar after 2 years of Zooms and screens. It's really an absolute pleasure to be here. The purpose of this presentation, the purpose of this webinar series, this is the first one of two, is really to open up a conversation within the outdoor industry that I don't think we're talking about enough. If you know POW, you know Protect Our Winters, you know that we have been talking for several years about the importance of civic engagement and voting and getting the right type of leadership in office from both sides of the aisle to advance climate policies forward. But a conversation that we are hoping to start and that we're hoping that this will trigger is really one that has as much to do with the future of climate policy and the deployment of clean energy in the world as a civic engagement conversation. And it's one about climate finance and what exactly is the connection between the fossil fuel industry and their interests and the large financial institutions that pretty much manage all of our money. So I'm hoping to keep it relatively short, but for the next several minutes, I'm going to dive into the following. I'm going to tell a short story of a couple of CEOs that pretty much determined the future of fossil fuel development around the world, how those actions actually are tied to the financial institutions that we're going to be discussing in a little bit of more detail. Then we'll take a little meander and wander into 16th century Dutch merchant ships before we talk about the carbon budget and what a carbon budget is and where we're at. And then we'll talk about the implications of running out of a carbon budget for the outdoor industry in particular, but most importantly, what it is that we can do about it, where it is, what are the choices in front of us, what it is that we can do about it. And then we'll have a question and answer and a follow-up conversation with Ben Stewart from Bank of the West, as well as with Brady Collins from Conservation Alliance, and ideally be able to answer some of your questions. So now that I've told you what it is that we'll be talking about, I'm going to load up and start the presentation. So thanks, everyone. This webinar is Moving Mountains with Money. What do we mean by that? Well, let's start with a tale of two CEOs. So Lee Raymond was the CEO of ExxonMobil from 1993 to 2005. Those of you that remember the 90s, if you're from my generation, might remember some of the Exxon Valdez spill, which was the first time that really globally attention was paid to a major oil spill. And then Rex Tillerson was the CEO of ExxonMobil from 2006 to 2017 before he stepped down to serve as U.S. Secretary of State under the Trump administration. Now, why are we talking about Lee and Rex? If you had asked Lee Raymond back in the 1990s, what was the one thing that kept him up at night? His response would have been reserves, oil reserves, bankable reserves. And he would have passed that concern on to Rex Tillerson. So for the better part of 2 decades, it was the issue of bankable reserves that preoccupied the CEOs of the prominent fossil fuel company in the world. Now, what are bankable reserves? Basically, bankable reserves are the amount of fossil fuels that are still on the ground that any fossil fuel company has the access to, and the legal, either the legal control or the ownership to extract from the ground. They're really important because a fossil fuel company's valuation is actually based on its fossil fuel reserves and their ability to continue their business, growth into the future. They have to report their oil reserves to the SEC. And investors make projections, and share prices go up or down based on those reserves. Now, why was Lee Raymond so concerned about reserves in the 1990s? Well, after the wave of nationalization that took over the Arab world that led to the oil embargo of the 1970s, US and European companies actually owned less than 20% of global oil reserves. So that posed an existential threat to them. This actually led to very aggressive interventions across the world, from Africa to direct negotiations, for example, with the Kurds during the Iraq War that bypassed the U.S. government. But most importantly, for the climate crisis and for the issues that we're talking about, it also led to a push for what we call extreme oil exploration. That meant looking for oil reserves in places that were off limits beforehand. That's places like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, that's the Arctic Circle, that is the Amazon Basin, deep offshore exploration, but also very relevantly, the advent in the boom of hydraulic fracturing as a new technology that ExxonMobil was definitely interested in. So it was Rex Tillerson who, in 2009, actually bought XTO, a fracking company, a hydraulic fracturing company called XTO, for about $38 billion. And after that merger with XTO, about 50% of ExxonMobil's oil reserves were actually natural gas. This shielded him from two things. One is it shielded ExxonMobil from potential climate change legislation that was moving through Congress at the time, or that was being negotiated in Congress at the time, that would have focused specifically on the carbon content, not the methane content of a fossil fuel. So it would have excluded their reserves in that sense. But it also opened up the entire Permian Basin and several other large natural gas deposits around the world. So ExxonMobil at that point actually became an energy company, not only an oil company. Now, to be clear, the question is not were there enough oil reserves on the ground to continue the expansion of companies like ExxonMobil or any other fossil fuel company. The question is there. I mean, the U.S. Energy Information says estimates that there are 44 billion barrels of crude oil and 495 trillion cubic feet of wet natural gas left underground. So the question is not, is there enough fossil fuel to maintain the business model? The question is the following, and it's, do these companies have direct ownership and or legal control to extract it? Is there regulation or legislation that would prevent them from extracting it, such as moratoriums on fossil fuel drilling in public lands, or putting certain places outside of the scope of leases like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge? But most equally importantly are and favorable forecasts for the price of oil and gas. So that valuation of $38 billion that I talked about, that valuation was based on very favorable projections for the price of natural gas. Now, as we've seen over the course of the last 2 years, if there's anything that the pandemic has taught us, is that the fossil fuel market, particularly oil and gas, are very subject to global geopolitics and very volatile in their price. So what companies need, what fossil fuel companies need, is a certain level of assurance to finance these projects and to finance the development of these projects. That $38 billion deal with XTO was facilitated and financed by JP Morgan Chase and Barclays. And this is just one example of a very long history of financial institutions and fossil fuel companies accepting certain levels of risk in order to drive forward the business model of fossil fuel companies. And that's what we want to talk about, because what we're looking at is the basic idea of a carbon budget. So what is a carbon budget? The carbon budget is not a fixed number, but it's a probability. It's a probability estimate. So how many fossil fuels we take off the ground will directly impact how much greenhouse gases go out into the atmosphere and how much carbon is deposited into the atmosphere. What we see in this graphic right here is, on the left-hand side in white, you see all the fossil fuels that have been burned since the Industrial Revolution until the beginning of this decade. Now, the center of it is the fossil fuels that have been burned in the last 2 decades alone. What it does is, on the right side of the graph, you see how many gigatons of carbon dioxide remain that could be emitted into the atmosphere if we burnt everything that is left. So those 430 trillion cubic feet of wet natural gas, or 48 billion barrels of gas. The reality is, if we have any hope of keeping temperatures within the 1.5 degree limit that was agreed upon in Paris, that the science is urgently telling us we have to stay within in order not to exceed that limit, we can't burn all of the fossil fuels that remain on the ground. And that is the key. If you take nothing else away from this presentation, that is the key takeaway. There is far more fossil fuel left on the ground than what we can safely burn. And so what happens? The assets that are dependent on being able to burn those fossil fuels, or extract and burn those fossil fuels, account for about $22 trillion. So there's 2 paths here, and there's 2 levels of risk. One, we will continue on business as usual, and we can bake the planet many times over. Or 2, we will take action and reduce and regulate and reduce the amount of fossil fuels that are burnt over the course of the next 3 to 4 decades. If we take the former path, door number one, the impacts that we have seen to date will be nothing compared to what's coming down the pipeline, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. If we go door number 2, then the fossil fuel company and associated service providers such as transport, etc., will be looking at a significant amount of capital of stranded assets. So bottom line is, there's huge risk either way, and what we have to choose is, what type of risk are we going to manage? Which path are we going to go down? The former oil minister of Saudi Arabia is quoted as saying that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. And so the oil age won't end because we run out of oil. The oil age must end because we realize that there's a better path on the horizon for us, and that the risk is far too great for us to continue supporting that business model and this alliance between large financial institutions who manage our capital, who manage our money, and their investment in that business model for the foreseeable future. And we decide we're going to actually move forward with clean energy technologies down a different path. So here's where we're going to take a slight detour and talk really quickly. This is a fluit, and I just learned that last week. And a fluit is a Dutch sailing vessel that was originally designed as a cargo vessel, and it originated in the 16th century. And it was designed because in the 16th century, Dutch enterprise was really the foundation of modern capitalism. Private enterprises sought financing from a diversity of shareholders and a diversity of investors who saw so much promise in the colonization of places like Indonesia and South Africa, with all of the horrid consequences that brought about for people there. But they were willing to accept the risks of exploration and the risks of those embarkations for the potential profit, because they saw the returns as being worth it. And honestly, and that is, as Yuval Noah Harari argues in his book *Sapiens*, like that is the foundation of capitalism. The foundation of the modern capitalist system is this idea that we trust enough in the future and in the profits and in the profits for the future that we're willing to accept a certain level of risk in the present. Well, the reality is that the level of risk that we are accepting by supporting a fossil fuel driven economy in the present is way too high for what we'll be able to for what we can actually cover economically, and we'll get into that here in a minute. So that is a fluit. That is the advent of modern capitalism. That is a ship embarking on exploration in hopes of reaping profits for its shareholders. And this is where we are today. Where we are today is that the major financing institutions in the world are banking and are financing ships that are headed down a fossil fuel pathway. So this is taken from the Carbon Majors report. And in as many of you might remember, in 2015, not only governments but also the private sector made certain pledges and made certain agreements. One of the agreements was to start transitioning business models and financing practices towards a clean energy future. One of the commitments that was made in Paris was $120 billion of annual of clean capital transferred from the developed to developing nations per year. We are far short of that. We've been, by some estimates, we're running at about 20 to 15% of that. But what has not slowed down, and what financial institutions have continued to finance at 10x that magnitude, are fossil fuels. So leading the pack are JP Morgan Chase, since the Paris Agreement, have contributed $317 billion to fossil fuel development, followed by Citigroup and Wells Fargo at about $220 billion apiece. We also know that Bank of America at $120 billion, Barclays at $120 billion, BNP Paribas at $120 billion. Now, if we put together, we've had a lot of debate about recently, as we've talked, the negotiated infrastructure, about the cost of infrastructure, and the argument against that we've heard against it is the cost, how much it will cost to actually renew our grid, deploy electric vehicles, set up 500,000 miles of high voltage lines to allow for clean energy to go into the grid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, just to give a sense of context and a sense of for comparison, the entire cost of the original American Jobs Plan clean energy proposals, climate-related proposals, so I'm leaving out all of the social proposals, the education proposals, et cetera. Those that were strictly climate-related were amount to $750 or $800 billion, in comparison to the $3.8 trillion that the fossil fuel industry has financed since the financial industry has financed since the Paris Agreement. Now, I want to be fair. Some of these financial institutions have set some very strict regulations around what type of fossil fuel projects they're willing to fund and which ones are off limits. So things like leaving off some of the most extreme forms of development, like tar sands or Arctic drilling, etc. Whereas others have gone all in. JP Morgan Chase has gone all in. Their CEO, Jared Diamond, recently at a congressional hearing said that they support the fossil fuel industry, always have, and plan to continue to do so, while helping them to mitigate their climate impact and their financed emissions. Unfortunately, these two things don't really go hand in hand, because and a report by the International Energy Agency has told us that in order to get to the Paris goal of 1.5 degrees, there can be no new fossil fuel project financing starting this year. And anything that we do beyond that is really putting the rest of the world in risk. And particularly, and this is where it becomes relevant to us, particularly our industry. So for those of us that enjoy recreating outside, whether it be mountain biking, climbing, or snow sports, we're all very aware, particularly if we live in the West, that of the extreme, of both the extreme fires, their intensity, their frequency, and their magnitude. Last year, more than 10 million acres burnt across the U.S. This summer, there's been 83 large wildfires that have been burning across the Western U.S., and smoke from those wildfires has blown over to Maine. I was in Maine, in fact, in August. They had some of the smoke. DC. There's actually reports that they've registered smoke from the U.S. wildfires all the way in Siberia. At POW, we're actually working on a report to look at what are the impacts on our industry on wildfires. But things that we can think of really quickly are obviously decreased recreation, a decrease in the number of recreation days because of air quality, the decrease in areas and damage to the resource itself because of burnt forest, burnt land, and also for us in the winter industry, decreased the infrastructure threats to ski resorts, decreased precipitation in winter, the decreased length of winter. We estimate a POWER report that's available on our website estimates that there's about 190,000 jobs that are at risk from climate change because of decreased precipitation and shorter winters. Now, so that's on the consumer side in terms of the impacts to us as consumers. But let's talk a little bit also about the impact to supply chains and to the industry in itself. So several studies quantify that there's probably going to be about a 10 to 15% decrease in productivity across the supply chain because of health impacts of climate change in manufacturing and in transport. But also Swiss Re, which is a reinsurer, and their job is to manage risk, has warned that inaction on climate is no longer an option. So this isn't coming from a traditional NGO or an environmental group or even a government. This is coming from the largest reinsurer in the world. And basically what they're saying is that if we continue on the path that we are on, it's likely that we will see 18% decrease in global GDP if we actually implement some of the policies that are being discussed and being put in place right now. We're likely to see about a 10% decrease in GDP, in global GDP. And if we actually hit the 1.5 degree pathway, we're still likely to see about 4% decrease in GDP. The areas that will be mostly affected are South and Southeast Asia. Now, for those of you in the industry, you know what that means in terms of threats to the supply chain. Amer Sports, which is the holding company for Arc'teryx and Atomic and some of the other large brands, 63% of their production is based in China or other parts of Southeast Asia. The same, I think, VF, if I remember correctly, about 93% of their production is sourced from Southeast Asia. Burton has several manufacturing facilities that they rely on in the Asia Pacific region, and even Patagonia relies heavily on that region for supply chain. Now, those impacts range from sea level rise threatening the coast and driving migration to hurricane susceptibility. and overall disruption of supply chains and productivity losses in the region. So obviously the impacts are significant, and for our industry in particular, they're a real threat to the supply chain and to a consumer. So the question that we want to be addressing in this session and over the next couple of in the next session as well, that we will do the follow-up to this, is really so what can we do about it, and what are the risks? The way that I see it, there's two real risks, and we have to pick one or the other. So risk number one is, as holding companies, if our retirement funds, if our bank accounts are linked to financial institutions that are actually subsidizing or facilitating debt or facilitating credit to fossil fuel companies, then basically our money is working against our greater purpose and is working against our own business model. And unless that changes pretty rapidly, pretty soon, we're going to be suffering the impacts pretty severely, and probably ahead of many other industries. Now, so that's one risk. The second level of risk is the world actually wakes up the way that we're seeing it happen, and we follow the International Energy Agency's recommendation and model for transforming the entire energy economy over the course of the next 3 decades. What that means is that the fossil fuel industry investment and finance would drop from $575 billion annually to about $110 billion by mid-century. That would leave $33 trillion worth of capital assets stranded, and obviously have a huge ripple effect across the financial system as a whole. So as investors, we need to be thinking, well, do we want our money to be working against our greater purpose and our goals, not to mention the ethical responsibility that we have to manage our money in a way that is responsible towards those goals and that purpose? Or also, do we want to take the risk of financial regulations and legislation and a shift in capital allocation happening and really affecting the bottom line of our investments? I'm a little bit ahead of my skis on this topic, which is why I'm so glad that we're going to have a follow-up to this webinar with people who know far more about that area of this topic than I do. But that's really the way that I see it. We have to pick a pathway, and the reality is that the pathway that's being laid before us by the International Energy Agency actually is realistic. It's aggressive, but it's realistic and it's achievable. But it calls for a full transformation, not only of the way that we deploy our energy resources, but also of what we choose to finance and what financial institutions do with the money that we trust them with. So with that, I just want to say thank you so very much for joining. I appreciate the attention to this. It's really meant to open up the conversation, start all of us thinking about what is this connection, and then open the door for those of you who are interested in learning more about it to find out what you can do. And if you're interested in finding out more about this, what I just talked about, we have a white paper available that Maddie's going to throw up in the chat. It's not a long read. It's about 6 pages. It has a lot of the figures that I covered, as well as the overall narrative, and it'll provide the context for those of you that are interested in the follow-up to this conversation. So with that said, thank you so very much. I really appreciate everyone's attention. And if we can take the deck off, Maddie, I'm not actually, I learned how to put the deck on, didn't learn how to take the deck off. So thanks, everyone. And I would love now to open it up for a conversation. I'd love to welcome Ben from Bank of the West and Brady Collins from Conservation Alliance, our partners in this project.
Hey, Mario. Hey, everybody. Brady Robinson here, Executive Director for the Conservation Alliance. Good to be here. After such an exhaustive presentation, Mario, I don't really know that I have a whole lot to add.
Well, so Brady, I think I'd love for us to talk a little bit about a tangible example around what happened with the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and Ben as well, if you want to jump in on this. But I think the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was a prime example of a perfect storm on the finance side, where financial institutions decided that they weren't willing to take the risk, both because of public opposition, but also the volatility of the price. So maybe, do you want to just share the broad outlines of that story? And then, Ben, I'd love for you to jump in from financial institutions' perspective on managing the risk of extreme exploration.
Yeah. Thanks, Mario. Yeah, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, I mean, we could talk about that for a whole hour. I'll just briefly say it was established in the Eisenhower administration in the 1960s. And it's been a political battleground for decades. It's the home of the Gwich'in people and the porcupine caribou herd, which has been a huge part of their story and their source of sustenance and culture for generations. It's one of the finest examples of wilderness that exists anywhere in the world to this day. And it's got an intact, naturally functioning Arctic and subarctic ecosystem. It is probably one of the most perfect examples of the places that we do not need to be drilling for oil and gas. And without getting into all the details, it's become highly politicized. The interesting truth is, when the lease sale finally did go up several years ago, there were very few bids. It's not that economic to even get oil and gas out of the ground there, but it's become a political football between Murkowski and various administrations. During a budget reconciliation process in 2017, the Trump administration mandated that the BLM offer lease sales to the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve, and that is in the process of being reversed by the Biden administration. There's actually a bill in the House right now to undo that. But long story short, the voice of business, and specifically banks backing away from this issue, it served to elevate the discussion. It undermined the rhetoric, the political polarized rhetoric. When suddenly we make an economic argument, it's not a jobs versus the environment, and there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. That's just such a gross oversimplification, and frankly, a disgusting narrative that is antithetical to us having a future on this planet. We can thrive economically, and we can live sustainably. The two are not at odds. And so when business comes in and says this isn't profitable, this isn't right, we stand for more than just the bottom line. It serves, again, to elevate the national discussion, and it serves to undermine the political rhetoric. And so when a number of banks, ultimately all the major banks in the United States, with one long kind of holdout there, we can get into that or not, when all the banks stepped away from it, it changed the discussion. And without getting, again, too much into the details, Mario, we in the nonprofit space, so the Conservation Alliance, we have business members, and we fund and advocate for the protection of wild places using the voice of business. And so that's what we do on a day-to-day basis. And when we've been funding the Gwich'in Steering Committee and the Alaska Wilderness League, for over a decade. And I'm relatively new at the Alliance. We're doing all this work in public, and then meanwhile, I'm banking online and realize that the bank I'm banking with hasn't taken a stand on the Arctic. And fundamentally, it was this moment of stark realization, stare at the wall moment, where we as an organization are not living in alignment with our values with these business practices. And so we'll talk more at the next session about what that narrative looked like, the actions that we took at the Alliance, and how the kind of nuts and bolts of using the voice of business to elevate the national discussion on these sorts of issues. But suffice it to say that we did take action and feel really good about the actions that we took. So hopefully that is a decent overview of an extremely complicated situation.
Yeah. Thanks, Brady. And I think you mentioned it at the beginning, but to emphasize, I think the original projection from the administration for what that lease sale would bring was somewhere in the billions of dollars, and ultimately there were two leases that sold for something like 16 million, and who knows if they'll actually
1% of the projection. Yeah, this whole idea that there was this great bounty to be had, it was just hot air, to use a PG term. So,
yeah. And so, Ben, would you like to weigh in, and particularly from the financial institution perspective, in terms of how you guys are managing the risk?
Well, but yeah, the risk is one part, but the other is just the raw dollars. I mean, if you think about how many bank deposits are out there and how many assets are under management, you're talking $100 trillion. And that is a lot of money that can move a market. And, some of that's in bank deposits, some of that's in debt, some of that's in stocks and bonds. But it's really important to understand the role that money plays in either decreasing the risk, to your point, or increasing the risk with increased financing of the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah. And so, earlier this year, the Biden administration, and spearheaded by John Kerry and Secretary Yeller, have started asking the SEC to come up with pressure tests and a requirement for a financial disclosure risk for a climate risk disclosure from financial institutions. It looks like other banks, such as the Central European banks and the Bank of London, are following similar practices. To be perfectly clear, I'd love to talk about, and Ben, if you could talk to us about how is Bank of the West moving forward with their financing decisions, and how it's separated from BNP Paribas or not as well. Since we're having a conversation, I think we might as well address that head on.
Sure. I would say, at the Bank of the West, I think a lot of people know this, we essentially have zero fossil fuel exposure. I think 3 years ago, we had about 25 basis points of the entire bank, which is a $3 billion, $100 billion deposit bank. About 25 basis points, 0.25% was in fossil fuels. Today, we're sitting around 0.03 basis points. So we're tiny. We essentially don't have a lot of downstream risk associated with fossil fuels because we simply are not in that business. When it comes to BNP Paribas, their strategy is very much connected to two things. One is first and foremost getting out of the most harmful forms of fossil fuel extraction, which I think you mentioned, fracking, tar sands, Arctic drilling, coal, those sort of last ditch technologies to extract fossil fuels out. But then secondly, partnering with oil and gas companies to actually accelerate their move to renewable energy sources. And that's a huge part of their strategy. And I think if you look at where is the dollars and where are the investments coming from, unfortunately, for renewable energies, a lot of them are coming from oil and gas companies.
Yeah. Awesome. So I think if it's cool with you guys, with the time that we have left, I would love to answer some questions from the audience.
That sounds great.
Awesome. Maddie, I'll turn it over to you to bring people up.
Yes, and I didn't fully realize it looks like a wedding reception may break out and behind me at any given moment. Is the only place I could find. So sorry about that.
It's kind of festive, Ben.
Yes, yeah. It looks that way.
Well, we know it was kind of a last minute, so we appreciate you being able to accommodate and hop on. All right, Maddie, who do we have? Okay, so. All right, so I'd love to tackle one of the questions that we had here from Maggie Durkin was digging into the compensation of many ESG SRI funds. It becomes clear that profit is still the bottom line. How do we make sure socially responsible investment is actually responsible? Ben, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I guess, my only guide in that is making sure that you've got two things that are firmly in place. You've got to have policies in place, and you have to have governance. Because the one thing that we know, the term greenwashing gets thrown out all the time, and there are so many banks. There's some of the dirtiest fossil fuel banks on the planet are installing solar panels on their headquarters. But if you look carefully, you'll see that there aren't a lot of policies. There's no government. There's a lot of pledges, a lot of commitments, a lot of donations. And I think when you get past that rhetoric, whether it's banks' policies or whether you're getting into actual investment vehicles, green funds, green bonds, social impact bonds, you've got to really look at what kind of governance exists behind the scene and what kind of policies exist, because it's really easy to label anything as green. But that all stops when you've got governance. It all stops when you've got actual policies.
Mario, I might jump in on this one too.
Go for it.
It's really important. I'm a relative newcomer to thinking about this, but we've been shopping around at the Conservation Alliance for ESG funds. And there's some fund managers will take an existing fund and basically take the bad actors out and use a negative screen saying, we're going to take the existing fund and then the bad stuff is going to go out and then we're going to call it ESG. And then there's others that start from basically a zero basis and say, we're going to have some organizing principles about the sorts of businesses and companies we invest in. And here are the principles. And then they build it from the ground up. You can still have great growth with those more positively screened ESGs. And as a relatively new shopper for these sorts of things, I find those funds much more compelling. And I think the bottom line is you got to do your homework. Find a reputable manager or bank, but you got to do your homework because it's, a lot of people can hang a shingle out and call it an ESG at this point. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ben.
Everybody does it day in, day out. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'll pile on that one because I think there's a question here from Ben Fields as well. Where it's, are there areas where you see it could be value gained leverage as a transition away from fossil fuel investment or other types of tools to economically incentivize carbon reduction aside from political action? But I think that those two questions actually kind of tie together because it's no longer only an environmental argument. I think that when we see the price of coal bottoming out, 5 of the largest coal mining operations declaring bankruptcy in the last 5 years. We can talk about Arch Body or Peabody Coal, et cetera, like some of the restructuring. Solar outcompeting coal in most markets, even without subsidies. Wind gaining traction as well. And Ben, again, I'll defer to you on this one, but it seems to me, when Morgan Stanley acquired Calvert Investments, it wasn't because they wanted to only because they wanted to have an environmentally friendly fund. Is they actually realized that Calvert was outperforming a lot of the other funds. And as we see the price of renewables drop, as we see the price of fossil fuels actually go up, the volatility that driven by the geopolitics and the potential legislation and regulation of fossil fuel prices, that those two are no longer a choice between, do I need to make more profit or do I need to go green? Going green is actually what's going to be better for the bottom line.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was GE who first said green is green, and you're seeing that all over the place, not just in the big players, but there's even small capital manager here in Sausalito, where I'm at right now, Aperio, their largest fund and the one that has the greatest returns and the greatest flows is the green fund. And they're not diametrically opposed value. It's not a niche thing anymore. It's absolutely, it's actually where the funds are going, and it's actually where the returns are happening.
It's an extension of that false narrative, Mario. I think about the we either have environment or we have profit. And to flourish economically, the environment has to suffer. And for the environment to flourish, we have to sacrifice and somehow try to regress back into the dark ages. It's just a false narrative.
Absolutely. All right. So let's see if we have any other questions that we haven't answered. Maddie, anybody that wants to come on stage? If anyone wants to come on stage and ask a question, please let Maddie know. We love, Brady, Ben, and I have seen each other a lot over the course of the year, so we'd love to get some.
There's a lot of room up here, you guys. Don't be afraid.
3, I want to acknowledge, like, it's three middle-aged white guys up here talking about finance. So if there's anyone else that wants to jump on here, that would be fantastic.
Please put us out of our misery, for reals.
Technically, I'm not middle-aged any longer. So,
Oh, really? When does that stop?
Okay. Let's see. Maddie, do we have anyone that's... Here's a question. From a student's perspective, could you give a few examples of a career path from Andrew Fessler? A few examples of a career path that deals with this type of systemic sustainable change. A career in finance is obviously a prerequisite, but within finance, what do you believe would give someone the best chance to create genuine change? Banking, PE, private equity?
say if you want to do systemic change at this point, follow where the dollars are, and I think the dollars really are on the investment side, on the debt side, and on the deposit side. And for me, the things that are really interesting, again, and I think they are a huge part of the change, is when you get into social impact bonds, social impact investing. You really get to tie a positive social outcome to the return of a financial instrument. And that's pretty cool. I personally think that that's a pretty unique way to get into this. I think that would be the area that if I could start my career over again, man, if I could go into social impact investing, I think that would be pretty neat.
I'm wrong, but from what I'm hearing at least within the industry, is that no longer are the projects that are no longer are the only projects out there the ones that require multi-million, like $60-80 million investments. Like there are small funds making huge traction because there's such a diversity of available projects to invest in these days that range from community solar projects to bundled PPA, power purchase agreements, bundled PPAs, et cetera, so that you can actually enter the market pretty much at any level.
Yeah, the rooftop solar is really interesting, particularly when you start to get into I can go and fund the roof. I can go fund a solar installation for a particular rooftop and get the tax credit for that. I mean, you talk about micro. You're talking about I get to own a rooftop, and that is in itself sustainable investing at the very basic level. Yeah, that is a particular area where, boy, when we see when every rooftop becomes its own investment vehicle and tax credit vehicle, it's going to get pretty fun.
Let's see. So we've got a few more minutes here before we have to jump. So Andrew Fessler says, fantastic, thank you. I go and say for my background. What are your thoughts around holdings buying carbon offsets to meet ESG standards when they are still dependent on fossil fuels? Oh, don't even. Whew. So, I mean, I'll take a first stab at this one. Where do we even start? It's let me take a step back from how worked up I get about this and hit the high level answer. And it's the ultimate goal is not to pay more or to pay for permission to emit more greenhouse gases and continue to bake the planet, which is what a lot of these offsets to meet ESG standards within investment fund portfolios are doing. The goal is to actually reduce the emissions in the first place. And so if you're continuing to finance the new emissions or the production or the carbon intensity of products, and then thinking that you can simply net zero that out by buying offsets, it's simply the wrong, from the principle is off, because there is no balancing out. We have to get to net zero emissions, period. And we have to actually decarbonize the economy. So my sense is, for individuals, like if you want to actually support forests being planted in Costa Rica, and because you had to take this flight and you don't have an option to do it, great, go ahead, do it. Like you're not hurting anything. But to think that that is actually a large-scale systemic solution to the problem is simply going back to the topic we've been discussing, greenwashing. That's my take. Happy to hear anyone.
Agreed. No, they're not indulgences, right? It's like if they don't, yeah.
Yeah, you said it. It's not
That-
systemic. It's not
Yeah.
systemic.
Go ahead, Ben.
And so the reason we're, do organized events like this is because we're looking for change at scale, and we're looking for systemic change. And it's not systemic. So it's not bad, but certainly not long-term and not systemic.
Mario, I was watching the chat go by, and someone asked about, how do I approach my employer about making ESG funds available? How do I encourage local governments and schools to divest and move money out of dirty fossil fuels? I think the answer is, and this may sound overly simplistic, but it isn't actually, is to pay attention and ask. If one person asks, it may not be a big deal. If zero asks, no one's going to care. If it suddenly becomes a bigger deal, and I don't know what the tipping point is, but there's some groundswell moment at which, and we're approaching it, by the way, where this just becomes, yes, it's true of almost any change. Yesterday's crazy idea is today's kind of maybe there's something to which in tomorrow's like accepted wisdom and knowledge. That's how change happens. So we've got to be willing to ask, and we've got to be willing to talk to our banks about it, and let them and talk to the nonprofits that you support. Ask them. The number of huge endowments of big name nonprofits that are not invested, in keeping with their with their principles and mission is frankly shocking. And so I think we just pay attention and ask and bring attention to it, and that's how we're
be nosy and be noisy.
Yeah, and piggyback off of that, Brady. I think in my experience, in part of the reason why I wanted us to have this conversation, particularly within the industry, and Ben, you and I talked about this so many times. It's a lot of times, I don't think it's even intentional. And that was your experience at Conservation Alliance. It's simply a lack of awareness, because this has been the way that we've done business. This is who we've invested with for 20, 30 years. No one's asked the question in order to prompt an analysis of it. So I think that there's a lot of latent action that is sitting in all of our companies, waiting for someone to ask the question, and for CFOs and be like, let's look into it, and realize not only can we do it, it makes sense because we reduce our exposure to climate risk. We align our finances with our brand values, and we don't have to sacrifice profit. We don't have to sacrifice profit for it, or returns in order to do it.
Yeah. Mandy's feeling a little bit left out, and has asked her question twice. Posted this earlier, but is it safe to assume credit unions aren't investing in fossil fuel?
Yeah, they're a very safe bet.
Ben,
credit unions are great.
Answer that one for us?
There's not a lot of fossil fuel exposure, if any. And then you've got other great banks on this call, Amalgamated, Atmos. You've got other institutions as well, but credit unions are historically very, very clean. So a great choice if those fit your needs, for sure.
Okay. Posted this earlier. Yep. So I think we're getting to the end of the questions, at least that I can see. Brady, you've been monitoring the chat as well. Anything else that you see?
No. Let's see.
Okay. So I'd like the last one, and the reason I wanted to save this one for last, Maggie, as well. It's from Maggie Durkin as well, and it's digging in. From Brooke. How can we as individuals and businesses continue to pressure financial institutions into making climate positive decisions, aside from just moving your assets to a different bank? What about greenwashing? Do you ever find banks promote a positive public image but actually contributing to the climate crisis? And the reason I wanted to end with that question is because we're not going to answer it. And the reason we're not going to answer it is because there is going to be a follow-up session to this webinar that will move us away a little bit from the rhetoric and the theory behind it and the connections into very practical ways that we can actually that we can take action both as individuals and companies. So With that, I will turn it back over to Ben, who will talk a little bit more about how to participate in that session. Brady, Ben, it's been awesome collaborating with you guys on this project. It's amazing to see the level of interest we had. At one point, almost 80 participants on board. We still have close to 70 people listening in. So this has been a really fun project to work on, and I am really glad to be passing the baton to people who actually know what they're talking about for the next session.
Cheers.
Thanks, Mario.
Thank you, everyone who joined. Look forward to seeing you at the next session. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and just want to echo Mario's gratitude there to Brady and to Ben Stewart from Bank of the West that jumped on, as well as all of you that took the time out of your days to talk about this really critical issue. Now that we have an understanding of the connection between climate and finance, and kind of the 101 overview that we discussed today, as Mario referred to, the next session in early October is really going to dig deep with industry experts and organizations themselves that have taken action into greening their financial supply chain. We know that a lot of companies are working on sustainability practices for their companies, but I think oftentimes this piece about their financial supply chain is a conversation that's often left out. So on the next webinar, which again is going to be early October, we're going to talk about actual things that you can do to help your company green your financial supply chain, which we know is one of the most impactful things that a company and an individual can do for the planet and climate. So we're going to follow up with a form that you can fill out to let us know that if you're interested in taking this to the next level. Again, this was 101. The next webinar is where the rubber really meets the road. Look for an invitation from Maddie Peavy in the next couple of days to let us know that you're interested in the next piece of this in the next piece of this program. We really hope that you join. And again, just really appreciate all of your participation and interest in this subject matter. This really is one of the most impactful things that we can do as we talk about solving the climate crisis. So have a wonderful evening, everybody, and we will see everybody. Hopefully we'll see everybody again in early October.